I'll give you about a 1 minute, less than a 1 minute warning here. We're about to start. Hello and welcome to this meeting of the Council of the Town of Oakville. This is a special meeting that I've called so that we can hear from Dr. Zachary Spicer, Associate Professor and Head of the New College School of Public Policy and Administration at York University. Madam Clerk, as I understand it, we have regrets from Councillor Lischina and Councillor O'Meara, and it looks like all the rest of us are here. Council, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Probably a formality because we're not taking any action at this special meeting. But in case there's a declaration, Madam Clerk, there's no declaration. So it's with a great deal of pleasure and appreciation that I introduce Professor Spicer. I'm going to ask Professor Spicer to explain his background and his special knowledge of this subject because I think he can do it best. And he's prepared 15 or 20 minutes of material, and he's interested to entertain any questions you may have. I'll just tease you a little bit. In his quite interesting career, he spent time associated with an activity we may remember from 2018, 2019, which was the Fenn Ceiling review of regional governance. And so he can share with you a little bit of information about what he knows about that exercise. This, I think, should be approached as kind of a graduate seminar. All of you on council come with extraordinarily supercharged senses of curiosity. And here we have a person who knows this subject in depth, possibly better than anybody else. He wrote a book about some of what led to this, and it's a very good book. My wife teaches that book in her university classes. It's called The Boundary Bargain, and I recommend it, so does she. And with that, I'll call Dr. Spicer to the podium and invite the professor to treat us like graduate students, and let's delve into this topic, see what we can learn.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. I have a slideshow. Excellent. I think it's coming up on the screen right there. So as Mayor Burton mentioned, I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at York, where I'm also the head of Dew College, which is our graduate college in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. And I've spent a lot of my career thinking about how we organize municipal government across the province of Ontario. So as Mayor Burton mentioned, some of that original work looked at boundaries and how we've used them and how we set up the county system many, many years ago, all of which leads to the creation of regional government, which is what I'm going to primarily focus on today. I also had the opportunity to serve as a senior policy advisor for the province of Ontario during the 2018 Regional Government Review, where we reviewed the current functions and fiscal health of regions across the province. So all to say, I'm someone who has regional government on the brain quite a bit. In fact, I'm probably one of the few people who can say that with some joy. And so I'm very glad to be here to share some of the history with you and in the hopes that it is helpful as we move forward. Perfect. There we go. So, I think what prompts some of our thinking today about regional government is what the province of Ontario is up to, especially with Peel Region. So up here we have, I think, two. I'm not sure if the members of council can see this as well on their screens, but up here we have two ministers of municipal affairs and housing. The one, Darcy McHugh, I think is probably the most consequential minister that we've ever had in that particular portfolio. He was the architect of our regional government system. The man next to him is the current minister, who I think we can all agree has a very full plate of activities going on right now. He, of course, has the ability to be as consequential as Minister McHugh. As we proceed with the review of regional government and we look at the ongoing dissolution in Peel, Mr. Calandra, I think, has the opportunity to fundamentally reshape the map as Darcy McHugh did. So when we think about regional government, and as Mayor Burton said, this would be a little bit like a graduate seminar. So I want to start with a bit of deep history and think about our county system a little bit in the hopes that it helps us better understand the context of what brings us to this particular regional moment. So to understand the way that we have organized municipalities across the province, we have to think about the important distinction between urban and rural. When we think about rural nowadays, I think we mostly think of farms. But these were deep divisions that had a lot of very serious cultural underpinnings. If you were from rural Ontario traditionally, you would see urban Ontario with a bit of mistrust. Those in rural Ontario saw cities as dangerous places. Dirty places, perhaps, even places of vice and in virtue, areas that were not connected to God in the same way that our rural communities were, areas that were traditionally seen as being close to the land, close to family, close to community. Cities were seen as being very anonymous. You could slip in and slip out without really knowing anyone, and that, to some people, was frightening. This sort of vice and virtue that you would see in cities, of course, posed a bit of a threat to those who prized rural communities and rural life. And we see this demonstrated in popular literature at the time. This is William Cowper's A Task, where he talks about the town has tinged the country and stains appear upon the vestal's robe. And what he's talking about here is that the creep of some of these urban values onto rural communities. That there was this thought that this particular rural lifestyle was constantly under attack by creeping vice and virtue coming from our cities. Those in urban areas didn't necessarily see their lifestyle under threat the same way as those who lived in rural areas, though. They saw cities as places of opportunity, where maybe God didn't have the same sort of purview in places like this, but it also meant that your life wasn't as controlled as it was with the church's constant eye on you. Cities were places of opportunity where you could create your own life, you could go about your own business. There were places where there was fun, there was things to do. They didn't necessarily see any sort of threat from rural Ontario, but at the same time, they didn't want to be bogged down in the narrow politics, or what they saw as the narrow politics of rural life. They wanted to be free from some of those confines. So we created institutions that essentially separated urban from rural. And this is Robert Baldwin, who gave us responsible government here in Upper Canada. And we have the original Baldwin Act, which essentially separated rural from urban. It separated cities from our counties. And we look at the map of Ontario today, we notice that places like London and Guelph and Windsor and Peterborough are single-tier municipalities. And they've been that way for a very long time because we set certain population thresholds where cities would be automatically separated from the counties around them. And this was met with great fanfare. In some places, Guelph had tried for many, many years to reach that 10,000 population threshold. When they finally did, they threw a parade. They were free from county life, and they could go on and enjoy the status as being a city. However, the benefits to those who lived in urban areas were quickly extended to those who lived outside of them. And it was really the personal automobile that allowed us to do this. Now, there was a time when to benefit from the economics of urban life, you needed to live within the city. The car allowed us to expand beyond the city, that you could enjoy the economic benefits of urban life, but live in the county, live in the town, the village, or somewhere else. So growth began to emanate out of a lot of these urban centers. Toronto, for us, was the main place where a lot of this urban growth was emanating from. And here we have one of the early maps looking at metropolitan Toronto. Metropolitan Toronto was created in 1953, and it's the first time in Ontario's history where we had a city in a two-tier structure. Metropolitan Toronto was met with great fanfare here in Ontario, but also internationally. Many people began to think that we could potentially organize urban life in places like Tokyo and London, Frankfurt, and everywhere else that were experiencing the same sort of challenges brought upon by rapid urbanization. However, the urbanization that we saw coming out of Toronto didn't stop at the immediate borders of metropolitan Toronto. And we built the highway system that drew more economic benefits from the Greater Toronto Area outwards. And the same sort of forces of urbanization that we saw in the early 1950s was soon extended towards the entire region, which prompted the provincial government to begin thinking that there may be a way to organize life around Toronto in the same way that we did with metropolitan Toronto. A series of reports in the 1960s highlighted these particular challenges. This is one of the reports from the Select Committee on the Municipal Acts and Related Acts. And what they tell us is that the combination of popular growth of urbanization coupled with economic prosperity and futuristic thinking has created a need for greater forethought and a demand for community services never envisioned by the original authors of our municipal legislation. Those who were moving outside of the urban core still had expectations of urban services. Urban services that were not originally envisioned by those who were running our towns and villages. Something needed to change. The second committee here, the Ontario Committee on Taxation, which had a wide-ranging mandate looking at everything from sales taxes to income taxes and everything else, found that there was a great disjuncture between how services were being delivered and how they were being financed in municipalities across Ontario. And they brought to light, and they kind of squared in on what was then the inadequacy of the property tax. And I thought that there was a great challenge in how we were organizing governments to collect property taxes and transform those into services that would be used by residents. So they argue that we do not insist on a homogeneous approach to the complex question of municipal government in a jurisdiction as large and diverse as Ontario. They understood that the growth that was occurring wasn't happening consistently across the area around Toronto. They thought that there was a way that we could create a municipal federation that would better balance services and taxation ratios. And they put a series of conditions in place, things like community, balance, financial and functional cooperation, meaning that there had to be some sort of logic to create two-tier systems around communities, a natural financial center, and a way to enhance community without drawing distinctions primarily between urban and rural. They also agreed that the distinction between urban and rural was quickly blending. So we get the study and the creation of regional governments across the province of Ontario. Now, those who were responsible for these changes understood the scope of what they were doing. Premier John Robarts argued that this was the greatest restructuring of local government in the history of the province. And I think at that point, he was absolutely correct. We were bringing rural and urban together in a way that we had never done before. This was a marked departure from a century of thinking about municipal government and municipal organization. The whole idea here is that we would extend the economic benefits of urban life to rapidly suburbanizing areas to bring more harmony towards our municipal system. Darcy McHugh, though, was very much a realist. He understood he understood the scope and scale of what he was undertaking. But he argued that there needed to be that this system needed to be flexible in its provisions and responsive to changing circumstances. He understood that there wasn't going to be a one-size-fits-all model. We couldn't simply reproduce metropolitan Toronto, paste and copy across much of southern Ontario. There wasn't a system that was going to work. Regional government, by having cities back inside a two-tier structure, allowed for a flexible system that the county system never provided for. Because you could move services up and down as they were required, and you could bring a balance, more of a harmonious relationship between both areas. He also argued that we must accept the need for constant review and revision when the conditions warrant. Regional government was intended to be flexible. It was intended to change as circumstances warranted, and this was by design. In his 2016 biography, The Duke of Kent, Darcy McHugh argues that, looking back upon the system that he had a hand in creating, that it was not fomenting revolution as much as devolution. He understood that the rapid growth happening across southern Ontario could not be managed centrally. There's certainly a need for centralized institutions like GO Transit to move people around, the 400 series highways and things like that. But a lot of this growth had to be managed locally. Regional government, he thought, was a way to move responsibility for a lot of these challenges to become more local in nature. With that said, times change. And if you were to ask Darcy McHugh today about the system that he created, he would have no shortage of things to say about it. I was very fortunate to sort of get his thoughts when I was preparing my first book, The Boundary Bargain. That happened at the exact same time that Darcy McHugh was preparing his own memoirs, The Duke of Kent. And he reached out to me because he thought this issue about boundaries was a curious one, that he had been out of office for some time. He had quite a successful private sector career. And I think as he was writing his own memoirs, it was a nice opportunity for him to reflect upon the system and some of the things that I had wrote. He believes that there is a need for more central coordination. And he likes the notion of a big, broad, two-tier government, but not over any particular community, over what he sees as really the Greater Toronto Area. One that is flexible and fairly weak. One that would be kind of dominated by local interests, not centralized ones, but would provide a natural venue for service sharing if the need occurs. Going region by region, he recommended a series of changes, one of which came to Halton, where he said it should have two strong cities, Oakville and Burlington, and a redistribution of Northern Territory towards other counties and regional governments. So we stayed at a very interesting point in our province's municipal history, where a few of us know for sure what is going to be happening next. But I think to understand where we are going, it's important to understand where we've come from and understand the vast changes that we've gone through up to this point. I'll conclude there in the hopes that this was helpful for you to understand some of the context and history of the regional government system. And of course, as Mayor Burton mentioned, I'm more than happy to answer any questions or to get into a discussion about the utility of regional government, the history of the county system, or anything in between. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for a delightful seminar. Our first graduate student with a question is Councillor Adams.
Thank you very much. I found your material really very interesting. It's a fascinating history lesson in how we got to be where we are. And it kind of left off with a comment about the possibility of an Oakville-Burlington strong cities kind of situation. And I wondered what your thoughts were about Milton having grown so substantially over the last few years. Where do you feel they rank up with respect to being a single tier versus the need to be part of a larger organization? Same thing with, I mean, Halton Hills is obviously a much smaller place, but in the context of Halton, we've gone from really just having two major players to having this kind of third, almost middle power, if you will. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Certainly. So this is something that I thought about quite a bit when we were doing the 2018 review. When we create single-tier governments, we think a lot about sustainability. Are these places able to be fiscally sustainable? What would their fiscal health be? What would their service capacity be? We have a number of single-tier municipalities across the province, some of which are quite small. Prescott is a little over 4,000 people. You have St. Mary's, which is a little under 10,000 people. Right? These were places that were separated from their counties many years ago. And they've been quite resilient being single tiers. And I think also what is happening in Peel, I think, is very informative to the other regions. Because really, when you think about regional reform, some of this is very natural, right? In the sense that, you think about, could a place like Waterloo or Kitchener be a successful single tier? I think the answer, given their size and scale, is probably yes. And then you look at the rest of the region, you get the smaller places like Wellesley and Wilmot and everything else, and you think about, well, what would the impact be on them? With Peel region, I think the province has given us a bit of an answer to that about where that population line towards sustainability is. And one of the challenges with Peel was always, as you moved north, you would get kind of a cascading array of challenges, especially around servicing around places like Caledon. Caledon, I believe, is around 75,000 people. The province has determined that they would, at least right now, as a transition team works, would be a successful single-tier municipality. I think we have areas in different regional governments that are approaching that population mark. We also have single tiers across the province that are 5, 10, 15,000 people. So I think that the places like Halton Hills, like Milton, could successfully be single tiers. I think that there's a lot of study on the financial side that needs to be done on that. I don't have those numbers, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that. But just looking at the municipal map right now, we certainly have single tiers lower that have been successful, and I think that it is something that could be possible.
Okay, and then I have just one other question. I'll
Sure,
hand
of
it
course.
over to other people. And that is, there's been a lot of discussion about if there was a breakup of the region of Halton, for example, there would still potentially be the need for various shared service organizations, and whether those are separate or separate corporations, a utility corporation, for example, or something else, or whether it's truly a shared organization, kind of akin to the region itself as it is. What's your opinion on the governance structure of those kind of shared organizations, and whether appointed boards would be appropriate for them, or whether some kind of elected board or governance is better in terms of accountability to the public?
Great question. So that we have shared service agreements all across the province of Ontario, and some are, as simple as emergency management agreements, where there's, a very simple agreement that if there's a fire in one community, the fire service from another can cross the boundary and put the fire out, and it was really kind of indemnifies them from insurance. So we have small scale service sharing happening across the province, all the way up to major water sharing agreements like between York Region and the City of Toronto. So there's a number of ways to manage services with simple contracts, and you can scale that up on the governance side to even be like a special purpose body or something along those lines. Our common way of doing things like this is through appointment. And so if you were to have, say, if you were to continue with a shared police force or something along those lines, you could have a governing body that would have appointed councillors from each jurisdiction or something along those lines. I'll say there's a number of ways to structure arrangements like that to ensure that there is democratic accountability, but there's also quality in servicing. The province of Ontario has a very good database of a lot of these types of agreements, and in a 2013 review, the province identified about 1,000 shared service agreements across the province. And in some cases, they're simple. They're road clearing agreements or something like that. In some cases, they scaled all the way up to vital services. So there are ways of doing this. I think it's really about kind of tailoring the service to the needs of the community and finding the right governance structure. All to say there's a lot of pathways towards that.
Thank you, Councillor Adams. Councillor Dudek.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship. Dr. Spicer, thank you very much for your presentation. And it was quite interesting, as Councillor Adams referred, reading the whole document and trying to sort of digest the various aspects of it. The one thing I didn't really capture, and I'd appreciate your insight given you're studying this, how long did it take before they actually arrive at a decision? In other words, the process involved getting them to that ultimate target of either amalgamating or changing governments, the sort of levels of government, so to speak. Like right now, people are sort of disconcerted about how fast everything's moving. And they want to make sure, as you pointed out, the financial aspect is vetted properly before we leap into that. So I'm just wondering how much work they did before that decision got there.
Sure, and just so I'm clear, you're referring to the creation of regional governments. So, like, how much study there was before? But yeah, so there was quite a substantial amount. Both committees at the provincial level did quite a bit of the sort of early thinking around around identifying what some of the challenges around growth were presenting in each of these areas, and kind of what a federated model would look like. The question was, what would this look like in each of these areas? The Select Committee on the Municipal Act and related acts actually proposed that there would be upwards of 20 or 30 or 40 different regional governments, right? They were at first considering wide-scale change across the entire county system. That was scaled back, and then when we got to some of these local studies, there was an individual local study done in each of these areas. Sometimes they were done by academics, sometimes they were done by a combination of academics and public servants. Each of those looked at finances, servicing, geography, governance, what the ward boundaries should look like. They made recommendations upon, how you would elect members to a regional government, things along those lines. So I would say that there was quite a bit done, but it was done with the recognition that a lot of these things were going to be in the hands of the community members once these governments got up and running. So, they would make recommendations on, say, what the boundaries should look like. And if you go back to some of those earlier studies, they're fascinating because if everything that they had done was accepted, the municipal map would look very, very different today. Waterloo region, for instance, would include Guelph, right? Parts of Halton region would include Mississauga, right? So it would look very, very, very different. So we employed a lot of outsiders who came in and made recommendations. The minister took that and basically implemented a system that we have today. But the system took a number of years of study. The public was involved quite a bit. All of the municipal associations back then, and there were probably about a dozen or so. Today we have about a handful. They were all involved, but I could say that it was extensive and not uncontroversial, right? I think that this wasn't something that just sort of happened. I think a lot of people were very curious about what was happening. There was a lot of controversy, and I think that as we move forward, I think that's why the province started talking a lot about the flexible nature of the system. That that these were institutions designed to grow, because they understood that they couldn't put something in place and leave it forever, given that they understood that the growth was going to keep on going and going and going. So all to say, there was quite a bit.
Okay, well, interesting. You just pointed to something else that's been a concern, and that's the involvement of the public. So when they involved the public, was that through their local municipalities? Was that through, I don't think they'd have something like a referendum in that day, but I'm thinking, how did they get the public's input into that whole process? Because of course, the political arena would be involved in a certain level, but the public is a whole different animal.
Mm-hmm. So they did consultations and a lot of open houses. There's a section in Darcy McHugh's biography where he mentions that the airport then in Chatham-Kent, he would arrive so late from all these various meetings across the province that they would leave the door open for him, and they would put a note saying, "Darcy, turn the light out once you've landed." So he was flying in and flying out from Chatham every single day, doing things. But the remarkable thing was that it was the minister himself who was appearing in all of these places, and all the ones too, like not just the regional governments that we have today, but places that were understudy. So he was appearing himself, and he was absorbing a lot of information. But this was a very different era, very different time. So there was a lot of open up the church basement doors and see who comes in, right? But a lot of that was done through the minister. So the minister and the minister staff were really the kind of the conduit there. Local politicians were mostly speaking through the relevant associations. But I think one of the challenge there was really that it was the minister who was absorbing various points of view. And I think this is the reason why I have so much admiration for him, was that he was really able to take all of that information himself and absorb it and digest it and create a system that we see today. So
Wow.
I'll say it was extensive.
Yes, to say the least. Thank you, Dr. Spicer.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the question.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Elgar?
Thank you, Hugh Burton. I really appreciate the presentation. Just trying to understand that you started off, the rural divide. And I guess, like, I'm trying to dig back in history. It was in '66 when they came up with the Agriculture and Rural Development Act, and that was exactly the same year they came up with the Design for Development. And you keep rolling down, it seemed like, what I found most interesting, it was always the provincial deputy treasurer and the treasurer in Ontario that became the chairs of all these committees. So there must have been a lot of financials involved in this. I'm thinking, if you got the treasurer and the deputy treasurer, they're the key people and everything, there's got to be a lot of financial reasons for what they did going forward. And you keep going, and they started with Toronto, Ottawa, London, and Thunder Bay as the centers. But like, do you have that data to show what made them do what they did? Because it seems like if the treasurer was in charge of it, it must have been an awful lot of money involved here with how they were going to save money.
Yeah. So just on that note, yeah, I think that it was a very different time in terms of the expectations of ministers. This was a time when the bureaucracy looked very, very different. I think that we have more of a culture now where we would have individual MPPs serving as committee chairs and things along those lines. I think that these individuals took on these roles primarily because they thought that this was important. And this really started looking at Ontario's financial system as a whole, right? They were looking at the income tax, sales taxes, property taxes, everything else, right? And property taxes was such a fundamental financial vehicle that they thought to get the tax services ratio correct, you need to look at the structure of the government's collecting it and delivering services. So the Treasury was intimately involved. I think that now, as the province has advanced and the scope of government has advanced, I don't know if the Minister of Finance would be as involved. He certainly wasn't involved in the 2018 review, but I mean, these aren't things that I think are divorced from Ontario's fiscal health right now. I think that there's a lot more centralization coming from the Premier's office now, right? I think in the day of John Robarts, you would see the minister take charge of files. I think we've just reached a point where there's such a great degree of centralization that a lot of these things are projects run directly out of the Premier's office. So all to say, I think there's a bit of a different approach now.
Yeah, I guess that's what scares me a little bit too, in that you think of the reason it was done, if you go to the financials, to save money for the people. That was the whole idea. And we can you have more people doing the same thing and bundle it together. It's so much better. And I'm not seeing any financials anywhere now. Now, with Peel, you probably have information about that, seeing what they must have done studies and had fairly big accounting firms analyzing the advantages and disadvantages.
Mm-hmm. So over the years, there's been a number of different fiscal studies. Mississauga did one that they submitted in 2018. The Region Appeal did another. I think the Region Appeal was done by KPMG. Mississauga's, I think it was done by Ernst & Young. So a lot of them, like the major financial players. I don't have any information on what the transition board is examining. I don't know if they're, I would expect that they're probably using a combination of provincial data and locally sourced data, but I don't know how they're formulating a lot of those decisions. I think one of the sort of points of criticism for those in Peel somewhat is that the transition board hasn't been, saying what they're using or how they've advanced the project so far. I expect that's probably coming. I think a certain degree of this, is best done internally before releasing things, but I can't say for certain what data sources they're actually using right now. I think it's probably a combination of things.
Because they haven't released it yet, how they are doing it, I guess.
No, they're very early in their work, though. I suspect that there are folks in Peel Region, Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon who know exactly where the project is. I don't think that they're privy to tell people, at least folks like me. So I'm fortunate I don't have a lot of information that I can share. I just don't know a lot about how that process is working internally right now.
Well, if you don't know a lot about it, I think know a lot less than you too. So, yeah, okay. Listen, I really appreciate that, because to me, it's all about economies of scale and trying to save money and do it more efficiently. And that's where I'm having trouble understanding if that in fact will happen. Or as you say, it's more of this is what we'd like to do, and the financials aren't important. So it's scary. Well,
I mean, it's not to say that the financials aren't important, but when creating governments, it's a combination of factors as well, right? Governance, representation, service quality. I think there's a lot of considerations at play. I don't think the transition board in Peel is working with a kind of a strict financial incentive. I think they're certainly looking at that. I don't think that the province would advance Peel's disillusion without thinking that there were some scale economies at play, or without thinking that they could potentially improve governance in one area or the other. So without knowing a lot about the work being done internally, it's hard for me to say for certain, but I think there's a number of different factors that they're probably considering as they move forward.
It'd be interesting to take the chair of Peel to come and talk to us also sometime. So I really appreciate you coming tonight. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Elger. Before I turn to the other two questions, it seems it would fit here. Professor, there were two things that I wonder if you could comment on. Darcy McHugh talking about the need for possibly bigger institutions at the shared level, such as, just to name one that the province has itself been floating in the last year or two, transit across the GTA region instead of across a local municipality or a regional municipality, but even bigger. And the second thing is there a panel coming up that Gary Kent will be on that the councillors or the public could attend if they're curious to see what might come out of that?
Certainly. So on the first note, there's a panel at York on December 7th. It's being hosted by the City Institute. Gary Kent will be one of the panelists on there. I will be as well, but knowing that Gary Kent's there, I'm not the star of the show by any means. I'm probably saying a lot of the same things that you've heard tonight, which everyone's more than welcome to join. I believe that Gary will be providing a bit of an update on what's happening in Peel as far as what he knows, and sharing, I think, some of his concerns about how the process has played out and potentially what the future of the three communities looks like. I think from my discussions with him, I think he's eager to share some of that. He's a consummate professional. I think he's doing a wonderful job so far. So on the other note about shared institutions, I think that what Darcy McHugh was hinting at was something akin to the BC regional district system, where you have very broad, flexible upper tier governments, but with interesting opt-out clauses. So some of the lower tier governments, some of which also include Indigenous governments, they can opt out of certain services. So those regional governments are significantly certainly weaker than what we have out here. And I think from a services perspective, a little bit more like a buffet, right? You can sort of pick and choose what you want, with the rationalization that there are scale economies in certain services over others. But with that said, I don't know if necessarily we're at the point of seeing something like that in Ontario, but we certainly have these sort of broad regional authorities. Metrolinx, I think, is a great example of that. And that conversation about uploading transit services, I think that there's very likely a lot of mayors who would say, please take it. And I think that that's a conversation that may mature a bit more in the future. I don't think the Metrolinx is eager to sort of take that on right now, but how to best integrate transit across the region is an ongoing conversation. It's something that we should be looking at more seriously, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. I forgot to mention that Gary Kent is the CAO of Peel. I mentioned that, I'm sure the councillors know it, but the public who are watching might not have understood the significance of the name. Councillor Longo and then Councillor Knoll.
Thank you, Your Worship. Great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Spicer. Very interesting. I enjoyed the report. It's kind of like a history lesson of how we've evolved. On the line of economies of scale and services, do you feel that there are some that would be kind of better served at a regional or, as you mentioned, kind of like a Metrolinx level? And I'm going to focus in on health because I think COVID taught us a couple things. And I'm in a shared service world in healthcare. One of the things that we found really frustrating is the public health world, they interpreted things completely differently with all the different kind of, I think there are 26 public health authorities, somehow also tied to municipalities. But do you see any specific, when you go through all the different services, do you see any that are sort of best kind of higher level versus a lower level? Do you have like an opinion on those kind of different services?
Yeah, admittedly, it's not something that I've given a lot of thought to. So just off the top of my head, I think you probably zeroed in on the one that would make a lot of natural sense to me, public health. I think probably having broader public health authorities would probably make sense. I think COVID probably demonstrated the utility of something like that. Transportation, I think, is one that is natural, trying to bring connections between regions and cities. Beyond that, I think I probably have to give it a little bit of thought. That's a fantastic question, though, and I think part of this exercise as a province moves forward is thinking about some of that, not just what could be brought up and centralized at the provincial level, but what could really be rationalized at a regional scale beyond the regional governments right now. I'll say fantastic question. You've got me stumped. I appreciate that. It's giving me something to think about, at least on the drive home. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
All right, Councillor Knoll, it's your turn to try to play Stump the Professor.
Well, I don't think I was planning on trying to do that. That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you. I always enjoy learning more about the province and its history. A couple quick questions. The first one is, I'm fascinated by your involvement in the 2018-2019 exercise, the regionalization, sort of the opposite of what we're going, this whiplash thing we're doing right now. Do you have any insights on that? Why the province chose to walk away from that initiative at the time?
Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of insight about the sort of internal decision-making about not taking action on the report. I should know I was a public servant, so I was a nonpartisan member of the government. A lot of the work that myself and my team did on that was to support Michael Fenn and Ken Sealing. So a lot of the background research, engagement, things of that nature, but I haven't read the final report myself, so I don't know what's in it, and I couldn't speak to why very little came of it. What I think is interesting about that exercise is that the province still has all that data, right? They still have the reports. They exist somewhere, lock and key probably somewhere, but they can be referenced. And I think that as we proceed into this next phase, I don't know if we can properly call it a regional review or whatever we're looking at right now. I think a lot of that previous work is going to come into play as we move forward. So all to say that I don't think it was a wasted exercise. I think it's some of that work and the opinions that were gathered at the time will inform some of the work going forward. But apologies, I can't give any. I don't have any inside information about that.
That spoiled my next question, because my next question was going to be: do you believe, in your opinion, that something from that exercise was the precursor to this current exercise we're going through? Was there something discovered at that time? I mean, I know the predication of what this exercise today is about housing, but I'm curious if there was something that came out of that that is, I guess, informing this process in terms of the outcomes are now informing what we're doing today. Is that, you wouldn't have any insight on that, I guess, since you don't?
Unfortunately not. I'm not sure exactly why the province decided to not take action at that point in time, but they're certainly sitting on a lot of data, a lot of public opinion data. There was an extensive survey work done. There was an engagement process. I think, received well over 2,000 responses in all the various regions. Some regions, some members of the public, I think, gave the advisors very clear advice on what they wanted to see. In some areas, there was a bit of consensus emerging. In other areas, there simply was not, which made things harder. Both the advisors engaged outside experts and consultants as well, all of which fed into that report. So I think a lot of that information has informed or will inform this particular exercise, but I don't know if there's anything in the report that signaled to the government that they should stop, continue on, pick it up at a later date, anything along those lines.
You know, as an academic, I guess you're predominantly teaching this, but I imagine you have your own opinions as well. Do you have if the Premier were to call you or the new Minister were to call you tomorrow and say, what is your best recommendation in this regard? Where would you fall on this whole issue, on this large issue today?
Sure. I certainly have my own thoughts about where things should go, and I would say that I think in certain areas, the regional system has a lot of utility. When we look at places like Durham region, I think it fits really, really well, right? In other cases, I think in a lot of our regional governments, they're sort of fitting like an old pair of shoes, in the sense that they pinch in some places and they're too loose in others, and something just doesn't necessarily feel right. Whether that means that we should dissolve regional governments, or whether we should fine-tune them by moving services up or down, or we should consider kind of strategic de-amalgamations of some areas. I think it depends on a region-by-region basis. If the Premier were to call me today and say, what should I do? I would say you really don't want to take a system-wide approach to this. Study individually, figure out what the community wants, and really don't be wedded to the past. I think municipal institutions change. They are meant to change. They are meant to evolve. It's not about the sort of fit forever. It's about the fit right now. And so I would encourage the Premier to really think deeply about each of these regions and think about what institutional setup allows them to flourish and thrive, not just now, but well into the future as well. And sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out, but
No,
I'm happy to go kind of region by region. I certainly have
like
my
I'm
own
back at
thoughts.
University
I think.
of Windsor.
Sorry?
I feel like I'm back at the University of Windsor talking to one of my professors back there, but okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I certainly have my own thoughts about what I would do in each of these regions. I think my wife is kind of getting tired of me talking about this at home, so I might as well talk about it in public, right? Durham, I think, works incredibly well. Niagara region, I think geography has always been a challenge there, that there isn't sort of a center, a locus where servicing works on a particular regional scale. I think they've always been frustrated by that because of their geography. I think Niagara would work fantastic as 3 single tiers. Waterloo region, I think, is a challenge, that you have very large centralized places like Kitchener and Waterloo that have grown together over years, and you have very small rural municipalities that have by design remained rural. I think that each could probably sustain itself as a single tier. So you also have Cambridge, which I think has a cultural and economic distinction from the rest of the region. I would probably separate the region. Simcoe County, I think, could actually benefit from becoming a regional government. I think that some of the challenges with Simcoe County emanate from the fact that Barrie and Orillia are not formally part of the county system, that there is no common council there to manage some of the growth, particularly the tremendous growth in the southern part of the county. Muskoka is not part of this particular review, but it is a regional government. I would do a council composition review there immediately. They have a very wonky way of counting residents, permanent residents, seasonal residents. I would immediately change that. I think that the region probably works well, but they need to get the assessment portion right. Peel region, we see what's happening there. And in Halton, I tend to agree with Darcy McHugh. I think that, that the region has reached a level of maturity where you could see 4 single-tier municipalities here. So with that said, that's just my thoughts without diving into the financials or anything else. But just from, my systems level view, I think there's very different ways to approach all of these regions. Some cases, no change. In other cases, very, very dramatic change.
I really like the question that Councillor Longo asked earlier about public health as well. I've been on council since 2000, and I had the pleasure of serving as chair of Health and Social Services for most of the first half of that time. And during that period of time, it seemed that we started the process of keeping the staff kept one box packed in case they were ready to bug out at any point, because the province kept threatening under successive governments that they were going to separate public health from the regional municipality. And so it's an interesting question as to whether or not the pandemic has actually informed that ongoing debate that seems to be imminent, a decision imminent, like has been for the last 20 years. So I'd be interested in learning more about that one as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think that there's some services that probably could be delivered on a more regional scale than what they are right now. So I think I would say too, if the Premier were to ask me, I would say consider that as well, right? Yeah. Thinking about the system as a whole.
Because we've ever tested that system, it was recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Knoll. I'd be remiss if I didn't remind you that when the minister announced the halt of the fen sealing expedition, he did credit Oakville for persuading him. So right there in public at the news conference. So sometimes we've been listened to. Councillor Hazlitt-Thiel.
Thank you for your presentation and for the paper. So I appreciate my council colleagues' comments because lots of my questions have been answered. I have 2 follow-ups. One is, are you aware of any research that's been done on best practices in regards to regional governance? So in other words, has somebody studied academically what has made a certain regional governments more effective?
So depends on what we mean by effective.
So I'm going to go back to this. So, there's economies of scale, that it's democratic, that it provides great services.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not aware of much that's looked at Ontario's regional government system. I think a lot of that research is probably tied up in the 2018 review that has sort of looked at some of those metrics. I think it's important to sort of point out too how unique Ontario's system is in an international context, right? We don't see a lot of governments like this. The U.S. has a couple of different examples that, when we look at city-county consolidation in certain areas of the U.S., Nashville, Miami, places like that. But in terms of sort of system-wide studies, it's tough to sort of point to a lot of things. I think that, when we look at economies of scale, there's been some really good work done by the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance. I encourage you to look at some work by a guy by the name of Adam Found. Adam Found is an economist and works as, I believe, the manager of capital assets for the city of Kawartha Lakes. He's also a fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. He's looked at economies of scale in certain areas like policing and fire. I think he's found that in certain services there are natural economies of scale to be found and potentially exploited because of regional government. So I would encourage you to look at some of his work. The IMFG has also done quite a bit of work in terms of municipal finances, comparing regional government to single tier, mostly around the amalgamation of Toronto. So I think where you would find some good comparative work is really some of the research around amalgamation. When we kind of went from either 2-tier systems to single tier, it provides a nice deviation point between the two.
Okay, thank you for that. Sounds like we need to do some more research. And I guess my only other follow-up is, strikingly in how you've written this, you have referred several times to some, what I would call core principles, that community consultation, engagement, that they were fundamental back when this was all being formed to the process. I'm actually heartened by that because it's good to see that principles and character carry on. There are some good things we can learn from history. And then the other that's in here is you talk about the importance, Robart said, of democratic control. And so they may, you've come to some conclusions, you've made some statements, but those are really compelling sort of core, I'll call principles of do you have a compelling reason to change, and will you honor and respect those core principles? So I appreciate the thought that went into the analysis, and it's always good to see perspective.
Yeah, I think at that point in time, that was definitely something that was front and center. I think that the government at that time was prepared to move forward centrally with the imposition of regional government, but they wanted the public to inform that process. And I think that Darcy McHugh, I think, would kind of see himself a bit like a watchmaker in a way, right? You can make the watch and set it, but it has to run on its own. And I think that what they really did was set governments that could be flexible and could be changed, different services up and down, stuff like that, all of which, were to be informed by the public through councils, through engagement sessions, things along those lines. As I mentioned, McHugh certainly put in a ton of mileage himself to hear what people said. So I think ultimately these are communities that are designed for the people who live there. And I think that's something that, that should always be kept in mind, right? It's easy to forget that it's the people who live in these places who should be driving them.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Dr. Spicer, for your presentation. Just a couple of questions, comments, and I'm going to specifically zero in on Halton Region, and like one size does not fit all, and I totally agree with that concept. With respect to capacity thresholds, what are the benchmarks with respect to looking at making decoupling or deamalgamating a region? What are the benchmarks to start those discussions? Is it financial? Is it efficiencies? All or more than that? What starts the ball rolling with respect to looking at the governance?
Sure. So we're in a bit of uncharted territory. What's happening in Peel is certainly unique. So I can't say that we have a lot of history to draw on when we're thinking about separation. We have a lot of history to draw on when we think about consolidation and creation and everything else. But I think if we think about what's the point where we think we need to engage in some degree of wide scale institutional change. It's hard to sort of point to, right? In some areas, it is going to be different, right? So when I was going kind of region by region and talking about Simcoe County and everything else, my thinking there is really informed by a number of factors. But what it's not informed by is sort of deep financial analysis, data that I don't really have a lot of access to. But when I look at rates of growth and services and capacity and things along those lines, that's where things begin, in my mind at least, to sort of think about some sort of change of some kind. Ultimately, it's my personal opinion, right? But when I look around the map and I can see certain things in some areas that fundamentally obscure things like service delivery and efficiency, like for Niagara region, geography has always been a challenge. It's a peninsula, right? It's tough to deliver services consistently throughout it. And I think that's always going to be a problem because the geography is not going to change. So the municipal institutions can change just to smooth out some of that. In Simcoe County, they have this tremendous growth and they have no common institutions to manage it. To me, that seems like, a call to change some of that. And maybe it's not regionalization. Maybe it is a joint planning board or some sort of other agency or board or commission that could, get all those politicians around the table along with staff and think about what's the best way that we can manage growth throughout there, absent of competition over development and everything else. So apologies, I can't be specific, but to me, when we sort of think about change, it really is a sort of it begins with this uncomfortableness. and really, I think it begins with folks like you who have to live the governance system, right? If it feels uncomfortable, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to blow the whole thing up, but maybe it means that we need to look at something different. So I'll unceremoniously kick the question back to you then. And apologies for not being as helpful as I possibly could be there.
That's okay, Dr. Spicer. I'm just a little bit of history going back with the city of Toronto when they brought all the boroughs in under the city of Toronto. And I lived through that with respect to where I was in my employment years and all my colleagues in the city of Toronto. Foreign follows function, but unfortunately people in those boroughs and or in the city of Toronto with the responsibilities, the hierarchies and structures were totally in chaos. So the word of caution with anything, when you start to look at changing or modifying or making drastic changes, it has major impact on human resources and how we deal with that. So that plan or strategy needs to be in concert with anything that we do on a governance, because if you trickle this down to all our service that provision and where the people go to work and who they respond to and who they report to and what the responsibilities is an enormous task. And it was quite obvious in history with the city of Toronto and what happened with that. And so I just leave it at that. It's one thing that we have to be very cautious of.
I would definitely agree with that. I think what we've seen from Ontario's history with amalgamation is that we don't see a lot of economies of scale. We don't see a lot of cost savings, tax reductions, things along those lines. So larger sometimes doesn't always mean better. And that's the reason why I'm so curious about what's happening in Peel, because we're going the other way in a very different exercise. We're making smaller units of government in a way, right? Which I think is interesting. In looking at Canada's municipal history, we haven't often gone smaller. We tend to go bigger. And when we do de-amalgamate, looking at places like Montreal and Winnipeg to a certain degree with the de-amalgamation of Headingley, when we try to break up larger units, sometimes we create different problems if we don't simply eliminate tiers of government and just sort of create a patchwork. Montreal, for instance, is a very, very complex system, but I think you have an excellent point about that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nanda.
Thank you, Mayor Burton. Thank you, Dr. Spicer, for your presentation and the reading material. I'm actually newer to council. I've only been here for about a year in region, so I don't have the expertise that a lot of my council colleagues have. So I'm just going to ask, just at a very high level, do you feel like we're fixing something that's broken? And in your opinion, would it hurt us to just stay status quo?
I think that's an excellent question, and sometimes it's the folks who are coming with fresh eyes who are best place to answer that, I think, right? I think it's tough for me to say from my particular vantage point. I haven't been able to sort of look through a lot of the data or anything else, so I'll stop short of making firm pronouncements on sort of what should or should not happen, absent of being able to sort of look through everything else with the region. We had the advisors in 2018 had the luxury of going through a lot of that data and public engagement data. I think that I certainly have my own thoughts and opinions of what ought to happen. I think that I think that if you were to remove Halton Region, I think you would find 4 viable communities. I think that you would probably need some way to sort of connect services in certain ways, policing, for instance. But it's tough for me to say what you should do. Really, I'm very good at saying what we have done. But I think some of those tough decisions are going to be for you. But I certainly appreciate the question. I think someone who's new to council will certainly have, I think, an interesting perspective on all that.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that. I was involved somewhat in the review of 2018 with some of my residents in the area. So, I do recall all of that, but also just taking into consideration, I guess, if there's going to be some joint contracts, aren't we sort of saying it is still a region? Like, how do you separate if we're going to have some services that need to be joint? That was one of my thoughts, that if we're still going to continue down that path, aren't we still sort of saying we will have a region without saying that we actually have it?
I think what you'd be saying is that there are some benefits in sharing certain services, and that doesn't mean that that has to continue forever. That means that you could potentially share policing services or paramedic services or sort of something along those lines. Those are contracts that could be managed in a very different way than a municipal corporation. Those are much more flexible arrangements. These sorts of contracts, they have termination clauses, they have sunset clauses, things along those lines. They have ways to monitor service quality. Where we see shared services agreements used across the province, they come into force. They get canceled. When they no longer serve a purpose, they can be canceled or abandoned or just simply not renewed. Governments can't easily be sort of shaken like that if they no longer serve a purpose, right? So I wouldn't say it would sort of re-regionalize the region, but I think it would probably provide very important connections to realize economies of scale in certain areas where you're benefiting from that right now, but potentially balance other factors like make it a bit easier to govern without another tier of government or something along those lines. So all to say there's benefits on both sides, but I think that it's the flexibility of those type of arrangements that are the real benefit.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Council. I think you've been, I'm not the professor, so I shouldn't judge you, but as a fellow student, I think we can be proud of ourselves for our questions. Professor, I just want to, one last question, keying off of what you said, that you're really best at talking about what we have done. And so that prompts the question, how much have we done two-tier government in Canada? How common is it in, 3,000 cities in Canada? And how common is it in the rest of North America, in the United States? And I'm just guessing, but I imagine they've got more than 30,000 cities, maybe 40, I don't know. How common?
Yeah, so regional governments are not particularly common. We certainly have two-tier governments. In certain provinces, we have county systems, some of which include cities, some of which don't. Certain provinces use kind of a district system as well. I think the degree of centralization that we see here in terms of servicing is quite unique compared to the rest of Canada. We have very strong regions here, where we see two-tier government across the country. You usually see much more weaker upper-tier governments that are really there to sort of provide a venue for discussion and really kind of a way to sort of manage regional services, mostly around transportation, water systems, stuff like that. Localized services are usually left to the lower tier. So all to say, we have governments that look like regional governments, but they tend to not be as centralized as what we have here in Ontario, which I think creates kind of a fairly unique system. Across the U.S., we have some areas where we have consolidated cities and counties, which act and look very similar to a regional government. So looking at, say, like Nashville, Miami, stuff like that, where the corporations between the city and county are the same. But again, the upper tier tends to be quite weak, right? And really there to sort of provide for regional continuity and servicing. So I'll just say I think that we're somewhat of an outlier in terms of the strength of the regions themselves, but two-tier government is not unique in terms throughout North America. Internationally, we see a variety of things, right? Metropolitan government is something that has been adopted elsewhere. We look at London, England, I think is kind of one of the more interesting examples where they had a really kind of flexible, interesting, and kind of innovative two-tier system that was eventually amalgamated, right? We see over time, which I think is interesting here, is that where you have metropolitan government, it usually become sort of one eventually. You usually see some sort of consolidation. I think that's why we have this natural tendency, if we think about regional government as this sort of stepping point, this transition period between two-tier government and full consolidation. What's interesting now with Peel is that we're going the opposite way. We're thinking about, well, what if we instead of pursue amalgamation and make larger governments to meet the sort of outside border, what if we eliminate the top layer? So again, we're in some fairly unique space here, which I think is why we live in some interesting municipal times.
Thank you very much. Those are great closing words, and I hope we pass the seminar. I'd like to solicit a mover and seconder for receipt of the presentation. Councillor Longo, Councillor Adams, any objection? There being none, that's carried. Council, we need a mover and seconder for consideration on reading of the confirmatory bylaw. Councillor Knoll, Councillor Hazzateel, thank you. Any objection? Carried. I'm delighted to say we had a successful seminar, and it's over now. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.